All right, here we go. So you guys realize, I think everyone realized probably real fast, there's no composting chapter in your manual. That's because that's the land topic that we cover. Each Master Gardener group, there's certain basic stuff that the state organization requires, and then they have optional other things that you can include. Some of them, one of them that's optional is organic gardening, but you do have a chapter on that one. And I think there's another one in there that's optional that there's a chapter on. And since we're putting you guys through the composting one, probably we'll get an email from Dr. Shields, the LMG state coordinator, in the very near future saying, did you guys write a chapter on composting to go into the Master Gardener handbook? And if that happens, actually, we'll send you guys all a copy of it. Yes?
I actually have a question on composting. Like, I've never done it, and it looks fun. Like, am I crazy if I'm not doing it? Like, other stuff has generally grown. Do I not know what I'm missing? Or is it about making the soil better or not letting it degrade over time? Or
Bingo. Yeah, making your soil sustainable, so you're putting things back in with your compost. You're not degrading your soil, you're not compacting it, you're not, I think of the soil as a bank, so we're not withdrawing too much, right, when we're growing. We're putting deposits back in, that's your compost. So,
I think it's also about recycling and reusing the waste instead of
Exactly.
putting the leaves and all the trees and everything out on the street to go to the landfill. You actually put them back in your yard.
exactly,
Yeah.
and that nutrient goes back into the soil system. It's improving your drainage, improving your compaction, your texture of the soil. All that organic matter is a good thing. So overall soil health, it benefits it. We don't use it as fertilizer. That's something I really want to tell people is like the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium is so low, it's not going to ever provide everything your crops or your plants need, no matter what you're growing. So it's got some of that, but it's mostly there to support the soil structure, the soil health, and the soil microbiology. If you got healthy soil, you get healthy plants.
and how, if the beds are mulched, how and when do I put it in and mix it in?
Well, ideally your mulch is rotting into compost, which it does. So I tend to mulch, and then when that mulch is pretty much broken down, I'll add another 3 inches of compost and mulch on top of that. So I'm not ever tilling or incorporating things. It's more of, I've heard it called lasagna gardening, where you're adding a layer periodically. And I'm growing in a raised bed on top of an old driveway. So I'm adding 3 inches in the spring and 3 inches in the fall.
Around the plants.
Yeah, because I still have crops in
Yeah.
there, so I try not to cover the base of the plants, but yeah, I'm adding it right on top of what's already there. It works good.
And down here in our environment, compost that you use, or if you're mulching, it's going to break down a whole lot faster than it does in some areas of the country. Up in the Northeast, you might mulch once a year. That's all you need to, because most of the time it's not breaking down. Down here, you probably, if you have a year-round landscape, you're probably going to need to mulch at least 3 times a year if you're using organic mulch, because it will break down that fast.
Is that just because of the heat?
Heat and moisture.
Yeah. Yeah, it never gets really cold, so everything just keeps going, and there's always moisture all the day long.
The only leaves I have access to are magnolia, and I have a lot of magnolia leaves, and they don't
break
compost
down.
them. But what I do is I put them in black plastic trash bags and throw in a shovel full of soil and put them underneath the house, and then my husband laughs at me. And 2 years later, I pull them out, and I've got leaf mold.
It works great.
And it's great, the plastic bags degenerate so that basically I've got a pile of leaf mold underneath the house that I then have to shovel out.
Another hack you can do with the magnolia leaves is if you have a push mower or a weed whacker, you can chop them up into smaller pieces and it increases that surface area. When we were landscaping, we'd end up with a ton of those magnolia leaves, and I tried to compost as much as possible. So I'd actually put them in a metal trash can and then use a weed whacker to kind of yeah.
And once they're chopped up, they will go ahead and break down
Like
pretty fast.
You could put that in your compost bin.
Yeah, you can put it right in the compost.
Yep, because it's, you know how waxy they are,
Yeah.
that top and bottom layer. When you chop them up, now suddenly you've got this edge where those little critters can get in there and break stuff down.
Mhm.
So, this is good. Other questions about composting? This is your chance to learn stuff.
One thing I wanted to point out about the composting and what we went through, you guys saw the difference between hot composting and cold composting. When in the morning class, someone was saying, you know, they always thought, you know, composting was easy, but going through the videos and everything, he said, this is a lot more involved than I really thought it
And
was.
we ended up, and then it was like, I said, wait, you look vegetable, it was like 3 hours and something. Wait, there's more,
Yeah.
it was very helpful.
Yeah, but I wanted to, part of the reason for that, from us teaching you is, you guys ever heard of the FSMA? That's the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it was passed, I think, in 2014. And it was passed, and it is targeted toward any commercial producers of food. And the idea is to essentially eliminate any food poisoning or outbreaks of disease caused by contaminated food. And so they have lots of rules and regulations. And Anna and I are both certified trainers in that. And one of them that is essentially they stopped a lot of stuff, and as USDA does research, they go back and add it to it. So just to give you an example, right now vermicompost is not allowed for commercial producers of food, because what they're trying to do is do the research to guarantee that if compost is used in food production, it has no human pathogens in it at all. They don't want any human pathogens. And so that's the composting idea and the approach that we take, talking to you about the hot composting, because that is right now the only approved method to produce compost that can be used for food production. And the reason being that when it goes through that hot composting process, they've all looked at it, they've done the test, and human pathogens and weed seeds and plant pathogens are killed by that thermophilic phase in hot composting. Now you think composting, as we told you what it was, at the very beginning of the videos, it's just the breakdown of organic matter. So composting, by that definition, has been happening ever since there's been organic matter on the earth. So it's not complicated. Nature does it, and it happens all the time. But a lot of it is cold composting instead of hot composting. And I used the example this morning. It's like botulism. Anyone who does home canning or even canning industry, there are certain standards that everything has to go through to prevent botulism. Botulism, I haven't heard of a case of botulism. I don't know whether I've used it. Okay, so that it does happen, but it's very, very rare. But the idea in all that's required if you're doing canning and processing, the idea is to not only make it rare, make it non-existent. And so that's the approach that FSMA takes with the composting. We want to make sure that if compost is used in food production, that all chances that we can, unless human error comes into play, all the chances for disease outbreaks is eliminated. And that can only be guaranteed by doing the hot composting method. And that's also a hot composting method for your plants. If you're doing the hot composting method and you have diseased plants, you can throw them in there. It's going to cook, and it's going to bake, and it's going to destroy the organisms that cause the disease. If you do cold composting, which most people have probably done all their life, you do cold composting, you throw diseased plants in there, and then you spray that compost in your garden, in a lot of cases, you're taking that disease from that one plant and now spreading it over your whole garden. And so, if you do cold composting, you got to be very careful about not putting weed seeds in and not putting diseased plant material in there. If you're doing hot composting, put it in there.
Do I have to have a special container for hot composting? I have a plastic one with the door at the bottom. Is that just for cold composting?
As long as you can get in there and stir it or you know, flip it, you can hot compost it.
Okay, good,
It's,
thanks.
is it like one with the little door at the bottom that shovel the finished stuff out?
Yes, and it has a lid that comes off too, so I could shovel. I just didn't know if I'd blow the house up. So I didn't have the right container. So how often does this spontaneous combustion happen with hot composting?
In Louisiana, almost never. In California, I've heard of it twice.
Ooh.
Yeah, but it's hot and dry.
It can happen.
It can happen, but it's rare here because of how humid and wet it is.
How about tumbler? I have a barrel tumbler, I mean, it's huge. And then I have a small one. And I never feel like anything really gets hot enough in there. though.
Is it in the sun or the shade?
They're both in the sun.
And how much material is in there? It has a
Probably
lot-
too much.
Okay. Too much or
No,
too little?
it's too little that usually is the problem.
Oh, really?
Because if you remember from the videos where we show the compost pile and show that the internal temperature of that pile, and there's a certain volume in a pile based on the volume of the
I can
pile
barely
that will get
turn
that
it
hot. And the outer edges don't get that hot. That's the stirring process that's needed. Because even when you're cold composting, a certain portion of that compost pile will get hot. And all the organisms will be killed in that little center part, but it's all the outside part that you have to keep turning to get rid of all of it. And so the more material you have, the larger that area internal that gets up to temperature. So it's worse to have a small amount of compost and try to do it than to
Problem is I
have a
can
large
barely
amount.
turn it.
Because there's so much.
Thermometer would help her.
Yeah, thermometer would definitely help.
That's what I was gonna ask, so you put your kitchen scraps in the top every week, like I do, in the same type of composter, and I have a thermometer, but I haven't used it yet.
Okay.
It seems like what you add is so small compared to the big bin, I can't see how the thermometer would be useful.
What other materials are you adding other than kitchen scraps?
The dry leaves.
Okay. And are you mixing and incorporating?
I don't mix it because it's so big and heavy, but I do, layer them, like every time I put compost on, I put some leaves on.
You'd have to flip or get like a fork in there to kind of stir all that new material into the old material to get up to temperature and actually hot compost. What you're doing is cold composting.
Yeah.
Yep.
And one thing about another, I don't know if it comes through in the video, we're probably repeating some stuff. But if you're doing hot composting and you're doing like that, like, okay, kitchen scraps in the evening that you've collected all day, you go dump them in your compost pile. And then you're taking the temperature and you say, well, last week it was up to 170 degrees, so now turning once, that's one turning at 170 degrees. But that's not true. As long as you're adding new material to your compost pile, you can't start the clock ticking on the temperature. Because if I have a compost pile and it's got up to 170 and I've turned it and it's gotten up to 170 and I've turned it again and it's starting to come up to 170 and I say, oh shoot, I should have put this in there. Now I'll throw that in there. Well, what I just put in there has not gone through that cooking stage. And I could have 6 cubic yards of beautiful compost, finished, no weed seeds alive, no microorganisms, disease-causing organisms in there that's alive. And then I throw in 2 gallons of diseased plant material from my garden. And I thought, oh, I wanted to put this in there too. Well, now that entire compost pile could get contaminated by the disease organisms on that one small amount that I put in there. So ideally, if you're composting, you have 2 compost bins or one that you fill it and you stop. And then you turn it and you turn it and you let it finish while you're collecting somewhere else. And when that one's finished, then you take the material and put it in that compost bin that you have. So as long as you're adding material, you aren't entering into those 4 phases. Yes, David?
So I put those bins where you can turn it, but I recently dumped it out and then squash started growing there. Does that mean that it wasn't hot enough?
Yep. With those tumblers, people really like them because they're small, they're easily contained, but there's not enough mass in there to get up to temperature. And sometimes they end up like liquefying the contents rather than composting it. I had that
a
happen
lot of
with mine.
liquid. Okay.
Yeah.
What about the earthworms that are in it? Do they get killed when
So if they are trapped in where it gets so hot, they will die. But what I've
The egg will
seen
get killed.
with the megafauna is what we call it, the big guys in the compost pile versus the bacteria, the little guys, they move. And when I flip my compost, I have 4 bins. So when I do one at a time, I'll notice that the worms are on the edges of the bin, like the next day, and then when it cools off, they go back in and I don't see them. Because I have the red wigglers. So it's like a hybrid vermicomposting, hot composting system. It's not like ideal, but it works.
Yes,
Alright,
sir.
so what the tons of digging hot enough, can you heat it up? On a barbecue grill or?
If you have something you can cook your compost in after it's all broken down, you will accomplish the
Which I would
same.
get it to like 160?
170 ideally.
Yeah, 160, 170.
If
You got the chart in there.
Yes. If you Google LSU Dr. Joe Willis microwave soil, there's a good YouTube video of Joe microwaving old potting mix to accomplish that. It gets it up to temperature and it sterilizes it. So you could watch that on YouTube.
Also killing the beneficial microbes.
Yes, it kills everything. With the compost pile though, what you want to do is kill the bad guys, and then ideally the good guys are coming from the edges and they're repopulating. But it doesn't take very long.
Yeah, they've done studies, and the good guys come back really fast in a compost when it does that.
I've seen as quick as 48 hours. With the populations, they'll like sample piles at different stages. Yeah, you can really go down a rabbit hole with that one.
Do you put all those worms in your garden when you pull the composted material out?
I don't bother to pick them out. I did this last time and put them in Tupperware bowls and I gave them away because I had so many. If they're in that garden, they're working for me just as well, so. Yeah, Richard. Oh, yeah.
So, I have a worm bin, I got it about 4 months ago, and I added more worms, I ordered some of the worms online. And I can tell when it needs more brown turds, this,
The
fruit flies.
fruit flies,
And then
yeah.
as much as a day, they can just be gone. But sometimes I open up the lid and some of the worms are moving up. I didn't smell, it's not acidic, like.
You don't smell any kind of like bad odors coming out of it?
No.
And there's plenty of
food.
food?
So yesterday I put more food. Sometimes when I put food, they kind of all seem like they barrel down.
Yeah, they go down and get under it.
But when I lifted it today, I put food yesterday, and when I lifted it today, but when I lifted it up, they kind of all started going down. But is there another?
Do you have enough bedding? Could it be too wet in there?
You know, I ordered last night after watching the videos, I ordered a moisture meter.
Yeah,
And then
that
I
helps.
ordered, the temperature. I don't think it's the temperature. It could be too moist, but how do I now at this point?
You can squeeze the bedding and you can
There's
use
a bunch of worms in it, that's what I didn't
You don't
wanna,
want to do that.
yeah.
I mean, if it's too moist, just add dry material.
Yeah.
Okay,
Then you'll eliminate that
So just
moisture.
add like, for instance,
Shredded newspaper.
yeah, and I
cardboard,
did that, yeah,
that kind of
but I
stuff.
probably need to add much more than that.
Yeah, if you have one of those commercial bins or, the home bins.
Yeah, home bins.
I find they get, with the humid weather, they stay a little too moist.
Okay.
And the bedding gets saturated pretty quickly compared to when I was doing it like in Chicago, for example, where the air is a lot drier.
So should I take out some of the ones that's really wet and then replace it with dry, or just keep piling
No, just
dry
keep
on?
incorporating,
Okay.
keep layering.
Okay.
With the worm bins, what's great is you can add layers of material, your bedding and your food, and the worms will go up and down through it just fine.
And I added cardboard too, after
Yeah, usually if they're coming up like that, this time of year, it's either too wet or it's too hot.
If it is too wet, yeah.
Yeah, my money's on too wet.
Yeah.
Other compost questions?
Can you hot compost in the ground, like in the pile, or can't you in a bin?
Oh, you can hot compost anywhere.
Anywhere?
Mine's on the ground. I've seen where the commercial guys, they're on a concrete pad. You can do it in a bin system, like pallets.
Instead of turning, it would just be shoveling and mixing it.
Yep, I have a short handled pitchfork.
You can even dig a hole in the ground and put it all in there. and
That
turn
works
it.
too.
You could do what, sorry?
Dig a, create a hole in the ground, like a
Like a pit or
like a little pit, throw everything in there, just stand on the edge and turn it, and it'll hot compost in there. As long as you got the 30-to-1 ratio more or less in a pile, usually with a pile, if you don't have it at least that size, you're not gonna get the internal temperature get up. But something that size or bigger, with that ratio, you will get the temperature go up and you will do hot composting if you turn it. The microorganisms are gonna be there, and they're just gonna cause it to happen.
So if you purchase commercial products, whatever big box of your choice, and it says compost on it, is that like a term of art that means that it has been through that process where it's hit the numbers, or can anyone sell anything as compost?
If you look at some of the stuff that's sold as compost, I think we would say in the video, good finished compost, if you grab a handle of it and look at it, you can't tell what the starting material is.
Yeah,
A lot of that stuff, you pull it out and you can see rice hulls, you can see chunks of wood and stuff in it. And so it's not fully composted, it's not finished. For the FSMA regulations, if a grower gets compost and uses it in his garden, he's responsible to get data from the composter. And the composter has to say, this lot of compost, which you purchased from me, I have the records that show it reached those temperatures.
But from a homeowner side, all that bagged material, you get it like Lowe's and Home Depot, there is zero regulation. And that goes for potting media, garden soil, and compost. It's not overseen at a federal or a state level.
So it's whatever they want to put on
So whatever
Yeah.
they wanna put in there.
it. So buyer beware.
Buyer beware. And we get a lot of calls from folks where they'll buy soil for a new garden, they'll put it in. It's got tons of wood material in it that's not broke down, and it absorbs all that nitrogen. They wanna know where the garden's not growing. I put compost in, it's brand new soil, what's wrong? And it's usually because it's not finished.
And we have some good composters in Louisiana. Schmelly's Dirt Farm is one, and Laughing Buddha. I think the optional videos on there is actually a visit to Laughing Buddha. He goes through and talks about what he does and the sad thing about that is, you guys are educating now, but people who buy compost, they'll look at what Laughing Buddha compost, and his compost will probably be usually a minimum of twice or 3 times the cost of a bag of compost from Home Depot or something like that. And so anyone who doesn't know the difference will say, well, I'm not gonna pay $30 for a bag when I can get one for 10, or I can get 3 and have 3 times as much. And so will be a big difference you'll see in really good finished compost. It will be more expensive. But you're getting what you pay for then.
Other questions or something?
Yeah, if you're gonna take the temperature of your pile, so like mine's a pile on the ground, but it gets pretty hot. You're saying you want the internal temperature?
Yeah, so like
So what
halfway
kind of
in.
thermometer have you have to get into the center of the pile?
Yeah, they make, well, we actually ordered some there.
They're laying on my porch right now.
Oh, they're on Joe's porch, but it's a long
They
little
just got
probe
delivered.
with the top digital reads, and next week we will have those so you can see them. And next week too, we want you to bring compostables to class because we're gonna build piles over there. There's a morning class and an evening class bin. You wanna show them? And we wanna make it interesting. So morning class versus evening class. I don't know what the class who wins yet, but there will be some sort of reward. So remember, we want our good ratio. So don't everyone bring your kitchen scraps. You know, we don't want all kitchen scraps. Make sure you're bringing leaves, your cardboard egg cartons. We want 30 parts brown, 1 part green, ideally, like we talked about in the videos. But each class has a 3-foot by 3-foot bin.
This is not a crab trap.
This is not a crab trap. But your class's bin, next week when you come to class, before we start class, throw all that material in there, and then each week you guys are responsible for flipping it, and we'll have those probes, and you can learn to take the temperature.
Is it called something specific, kind of thermometer?
If you Google soil thermometer, it'll come right up. They're
And
usually
on Amazon, you can actually put compost thermometer and it will find them. And they can be anywhere from 8 to 10 inches long to up to 4 feet long.
How much do you want us to bring in?
As much as you
well,
want.
we want to fill this, and if we have too much, there's a couple other bins over
This is
there.
about 1 cubic yard.
Yeah.
And then someone was asking earlier in the morning class about, well, this one, I put a bottom in it, and the great way to stir this one is dump it out, set the thing back up, and then shovel it all back in. So you're stirring it. If you had one without a bottom, which lot of homeowners do, I did that because I'll probably be moving this one around, is you just have the walls, it's easy just to pick it up, remove the walls, move it over, and then shovel everything into it. And so you just keep moving it back and forth like that, and you're stirring every time you do that. And if this was filled to the top, if this were filled to the top, when it's finished compost, it's gonna be down about here. So that's why you want something with volume to it. Because if you had one that was only, say, this tall, and we filled it, we'd get less compost.
You said we're supposed to put our stuff in on the way in?
Yeah, on your way in.
Where are they and how will we know which one's ours?
That's an excellent question. They will be clearly labeled and they will be to the back side of the greenhouse. You know where those fruit trees are? We'll have them tucked in there.
Here or across the back?
Across the street.
Back over the build-out.
Yep. And we have a couple of bins like this out there already, so you can kind of see one in progress. Yeah.
So I have one of those like commercial bins, because my yard is really small. Like, I was like worried about attracting rats.
Yes.
So what do you suggest for someone with a very small yard?
So what attracting rats comes down to mainly is what you put in the pile. They're attracted to oily foods, meat, dairy, breads, stuff like that.
Some of the things on the video we said shouldn't go into compost pile, that's one of the reasons,
That's the
and in some cases.
Okay, so like my coffee grounds, my like.
That should be fine.
Okay.
Vegetable and fruit peelings, stuff like that, eggshells, sometimes they will go for the eggshells, but if you bust them up and dry them out before you put them in there, they don't go for it as much.
Will it attract possums, because we already have a possum in the house.
So if you're putting kitchen scraps in your bin, make sure you cover it with something. The possums rarely dig down, I have possums too. I found they rarely want to dig through a bunch of brown material to get to the kitchen scraps.
So when you add new stuff, you're saying bury it under your,
Yeah, have like a little trowel or something to
Finished
dig,
material.
put it in the pile and cover it back up.
like you used to do it.
So if I have a hole in like the back corner of my little yard, and I just start throwing my stuff in there and then piling it up with the brown stuff, that'll work a lot better than my plastic.
It might actually. Yeah.
I'll just volunteer to bring a lot of newspaper in case we need
Okay.
it.
Perfect.
Okay, I have a question about things like that, like newspaper, cardboard. Should we be concerned about like that being treated with any chemicals?
So you don't want to put glossy paper in, I'm glad you asked, but newspaper and cardboard is printed with a soy-based ink. But the glossy stuff like magazines, that's usually petroleum-based ink, so that's kind of the division there. I throw junk mail in too, because that's usually soy-based too. The little plastic windows on like bill envelopes, so I try to keep that out.
Do you rip it up?
I do, yeah, I just kind of roughly rip it and throw it in.
Smaller the pieces, the faster it goes.
Yep. Over here, question?
Yeah, so I have a compost pile, it's kind of dug in the ground, but it's kind of a little bit under a tree in my backyard. So is that a problem, does it have to be in direct sunlight?
Nope, you can put them in the shade or the sun. They work just as well if you have that ratio balanced and the volume.
It will get hot no matter where it is.
Mine's all under trees too.
You'll see compost piles up in the northeast whenever it's 20 degrees or even down around 0, and you go to those compost piles, commercial composters especially, and steam will be rising because they're so hot. And you stand near them, and you don't need a jacket when they're giving off that much heat.
I have,
Oh, yeah.
I have a storage box, a storage box with holes drilled in it, with handles that snap and shut. What I have is a whole bunch of kitchen scraps that I've thrown away, thinking I'm composting. Obviously I wasn't, because I wasn't
Thinking
putting
about it,
brown stuff in there. So I have this stuff, just lots of it. Can I rehab it? Can I put some brown stuff in it and just?
Yep.
Should I take the lid off after I put that stuff?
Well, if it's a bin like this big,
Yeah, it's a bin.
is it full or you still got some room?
Like this.
You're gonna have to add 30 times whatever's in that bin to get it going
If
properly.
it's all green.
So we have to take the top off.
Yeah, or maybe even get a bigger thing to put it in, like
Yeah,
a
I
trash
have
can.
precious little
Yeah.
patio, so it's kind of like.
You can split it into 2 bins and stack them.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of goes into her question. I realized when I watched the videos that I've been like only really adding, when I initially started my compost, I did brown and green, but then over time, the past year or whatever, I've just been adding like my food scraps.
Yep.
I'm not really adding like all that brown. So is there a percentage, or you should just be like throwing whatever you have in there, like?
30 parts brown for every 1 part green.
Okay.
That's the ideal.
That's
And
the
you can
ideal.
go down like to 25 to 1 and maybe up to 35 to 1 and it'll still
30 to 1.
work pretty well.
So a lot of
A
brown.
lot of brown, but it breaks down very quickly.
So my compost is like not good right now.
You're not hot
Look at it.
composting, you're cold composting.
I'm cold composting. So add more brown, stir it more.
Yep, exactly.
It's the 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. And if you look, there's a chart that on the videos that shows certain things, a given unit of something, like wood chips, will have a lot more carbon in it than say, cardboard or something like that. And so, the thing is getting used to it, and the general rule of thumb, I think we give it in there, is like 2 parts or 3 parts to 1, something like that. It's because usually the carbon in brown materials is so concentrated. And so that's talking about more volume than it is anything. And you know, like with the greens, the browns usually, they're very, very low in water. And so that you think if you have a pound of shredded newspaper and a pound of lettuce leaves, well, if you were to dry those lettuce leaves down, now you might have a pound of newspaper and 1/30 of a pound of material over here because you've eliminated the water. And so that's why it's not strictly a 30 to 1 weight basis, it's a 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen basis. And in most green materials, there's a lot of water. And that's why it's not a strict 30 to 1, but the rule of thumb, I think, was like 3 to 1, because you're accounting for that water. But now, something like leaves or that lettuce, if you left it like laying out in the sun and it dried down, now it's all brown and crumbly. Well, it's still green. It counts as green material. So dry leaves that fall in the fall are still greens. They're not browns. And it's because of the amount of nitrogen in there. They are primarily high in nitrogen. So the drying process and the turning brown, all that's doing is eliminating the water that's in there. It's not changing them from high nitrogen to high carbon. Now I've got everyone really confused. But that's the whole, the process with the brown to green. I mean, they use that term because generally, brown is something like cardboard or wood, and green is grass and stuff like
I
that.
understood this, I'm confused. If I'm adding brown leaves, really green stuff, to my compost, then I have no ground.
Then you need to start getting newspaper and cardboard or wood chips.
Paper towels.
Cardboard egg cartons.
Oh, I have a lot of that.
Yeah. Toilet paper too.
What about dirt? Is that
Dirt is neutral, it doesn't even count.
It doesn't. Okay.
Back to the hole in the ground. Should I, how deep would you recommend?
How far can you reach comfortably with a shovel?
Probably like 3 feet. That's what you get.
So 3 feet. You don't want to have it too deep where you've got to kind of get in there. It's all about building it to human scale.
And then do you want to cover it? Because if it rains, is it just going to turn into a weird swamp?
Yeah, yeah. So here, because we get so much rain, a lot of folks cover their compost piles so that a lot of that good nutrient stuff doesn't leach away. You want to keep that in the pile, right? So throw a tarp over it. Mine's got like a sloped plastic roof over it. So it's a good idea in this climate. Up north, you don't have to do that.
Yeah, we get 60 inches of rain and they get 15 or 20 at
But
some
then
point.
you get moisture from the bottom.
You do, and it'll get plenty wet. You might have to water it if we get into a dry spell. I've done that before just with a hose, and then I'll flip it hit it again with the hose. Cause you wanna keep it moist enough for your soil microbes to do their thing. If it's dry, they're not actively consuming that material.
So I have a weird question. Somebody told me that worms were not native at all. You told me that?
They're right.
Well, so then if you're going to have a completely native garden, do you want to try to eliminate the worm from them at all costs, or is it
There's
fine?
no way you could possibly ever kill earthworms.
They're just
And even
now
if you
they're-
did, you got non-native bacteria and fungi in there.
So it's not something to worry about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they've
It's important,
naturalized. That
And
was,
native only means in reality.
we'll cover this in the
What historically, as far back as you can find out, was here. I mean, it had to come from somewhere at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a good question though, because we actually have some really invasive worms, like the hammerhead worms. Has anyone seen those? They're really long. Yeah. People are always like, oh, we gotta kill it with fire, and it's like, well, okay, if you saw one, chances are there's 20 more within 10 feet of you. Like, where are we gonna stop, you know? So things that are here are here. Unfortunately, the cat's out of the bag.
And some of them aren't bad to be here.
Right.
Honeybees, they're not native.
Nope.
And without them, there would be a lot less food produced in the US.
This is kind of tangential to that with the worms, but I saw that there's like a new guinea flatworm now that's showing up in Texas and Florida that is predating on earthworms. Is that happening in New Zealand?
In the western part of the state, they've had reports of it. The mollusk and mollusk and arthropod group on Facebook, if you want to get really dirty. The hammerhead worms will also consume the beneficial earthworms, but yeah, that New Guinea flatworm, it's in Texas, it's in Florida, and it's kind of working its way in on the Gulf Coast. Yeah. So we'll be seeing that.
I think I saw something about like pouring a specific temperature of water into the
Yeah, there's various ways of killing them. You don't want to cut those up because each one will just turn into a new worm, which is kind of fascinating. But yeah, that's another one that they think it came in with the nursery trend.
Oh,
It's really gross looking.
it's a flatworm?
It's a flatworm, and it came in with the nursery trade. People move plants, right? And sometimes plants have hitchhikers. That was a hitchhiker. Most things that we don't like in this area were hitchhikers at one time.
I never did.
Huh?
I never did.
You never hitchhiked? Other questions about compost? Yeah.
So, like the red picklers, I know it said above like 95 degrees, like you can fry them.
Yes.
I mean, but it gets hotter here. So how do you prevent that?
Most-
I
most-
like I don't have a garage to put like my compost in, so.
Most vermicompost bins that I've seen are setups in a residential situation where like under the shotgun house, or in the deep shade corner in the garden, and that's plenty for them. And if that bedding's deep enough and it's hot, they actually go down in the bedding where it's a little cooler. One thing you want to make sure you don't have is any sunlight hitting that bin, because it actually acts as a greenhouse effect and it can really kill them quick. But if you keep that bin under the house, or between the fence and the shed in the back corner of your garden where it never gets sunny, that's the best situation for them.
And like, if it does happen to hit any sunlight, what is like the threshold before?
95, so it doesn't take long. I've seen where somebody got like a bin for Christmas or a birthday. They put the bin in the yard, they put the worms in the bin, and they go check in an hour later, the worms are dead. So it doesn't take long at all. They're very sensitive.
So how do you use that then?
It's in the shade.
It's in the shade?
Yeah, it's put in the shade.
You keep it in the shade, even if it's 110 degrees outside, it's not gonna be that hot inside. Especially, they will move to the cooler center of it.
They're pretty
It starts to
smart.
warm up. They'll move away from the heat.
They have sensors all down their body, and they can tell where things are drier or wetter, where there's food. Like they travel, and they travel faster than they do.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions about composting? Okay, we might transition, switch gears.
Switch to propagation.
You guys ready for that?
Yeah.
You guys need a quick break or move right on in?
Yeah.
We
Lindsay actually brought a few composting things. What should we do with those tonight?
We've got some cold frame beds over here, you can put them in.
Or we can just
We can take
put them, we got a bucket out there, and we'll put them,
Yeah, we can put them in the
we'll
bucket.
put them in the bucket, and then when we move the bins over, we'll dump them in the bins.
Yep.
So if you brought something tonight, we will put it in your bin.
All right.
Oh, yeah, a couple of announcements, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to say to anybody that's interested, I have some beets up here that I don't eat, but I got from somebody, if anybody's interested. I have some beautiful, beautiful grass clippings in the back of my car, because I mowed my lawn before the rain today. I have a composter that's one of those rolling ones that I'm willing to give to anybody if they'd like it, they'd have to come to my house to pick it up. And I do have a big patch, it's 12 feet by 18 feet of the fake Home Depot grass. I don't know if anybody would have any use for that at all. But I have that would also need to be picked up at my house, and a truck for sure, and a couple people to move it, yeah. So if anybody's interested, just come see me.
Okay, who brought the purpose meeting?
I did.
Do you wanna tell us about your plant?
Yeah, so I brought a lot of crocosmia bulbs. They are aggressive. I've heard people say, oh, don't plant them, but the flowers are beautiful. They have these flower spikes in late spring of this gorgeous bright orange tubular flower comes out in this big raceme. And I just love them. They grow in full sun, they multiply like crazy, and please take some home because those all came out of one bed. What are they called? Crocosmia. 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 I don't know what the common name is.
Plant propagation.
Yeah, that's plant propagation. I've heard them called Byzantine gladiolas before.
They're kind of like glass.
That's
Is that a different
crocosmia,
thing?
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's a common, see, that's why you guys, we talk about common names or botanical names.
You can
There
Google
is
it. They're
something else
really
that's like
pretty.
too, which is really
Yeah,
nice.
that's the pink one, but you can come
Yeah.
to it.
And you would love to see the one over there, the Byzantine, nice long violet spikes of flower.
We might have to
Oh,
walk over there.
those are
So
beautiful.
these just finished blooming, so, and there's some seed heads on some of them. So just cut the tops off and plant bulbs.
Okay. Any other announcements or free stuff that you guys can add? Okay, great. We're gonna transition to plant propagation. Being that we are in the botanical garden and you're in this class, I'm not saying we're gonna rob the place blind, but you guys get to make cuttings and collect seed off plants that normally you would not be able to.
Wait, hold on.
We're gonna have fun tonight.
We're gonna be raiding the garden.
But normally, if you visit the New Orleans Botanical Garden, please do not pick anything. But because you're here tonight in the class, we're gonna make cuttings. We're gonna make cuttings the right way so that they thrive and you guys get to take those plants home later. We're gonna be collecting seed too, because it's not raining today here in this class. The first class got rained out, so unfortunately they didn't get to do everything.
Anna's gonna talk a little bit about the seed and seed
Yep.
collecting and that stuff like that.
Yep, we'll start with the seed collecting. This is something that I got into as a pandemic, like stay sane activity. You know, we all were looking for those things. I got tired of Netflix. So I got into collecting seed from my garden and from other places I was visiting. I got a permit through the Forest Service to collect in the national parks, in the nationally managed wild management areas, stuff like that. If you are in federal property or state-owned property, typically there's a permit or a permission process, so just be aware of that, like state parks. If you were gonna go to any of the state parks, you would have to contact the Department of Natural Resources and ask for a permit. You know, it's public lands, we can't just go in there and take whatever we want, right? If you are in a public park, like city park, there might be restrictions too, like the botanical garden. They really frown upon people coming and filling their pockets, although I've seen lots of people do that, don't do that. But the rest of city park has many, many opportunities to make cuttings and collect seed. Some of the best spots are the Harrison track off Wisner. If anyone's been to the abandoned golf course, there's a lot of good stuff in there. The Coterie Forest, right across the street from that, a lot of great stuff in there. Even the sculpture garden over here, where they've redone with natives, there's a lot of seed heads for collecting too. Pelican Greenhouse, which is propagating a lot of the plants for sale, but also for the gardens and throughout the park. They're collecting things from the park too. So they're collecting seed heads, they're making cuttings, they're producing those plants for here, for sale. So you have access to a lot of that same kind of plant material, essentially. So if you learn how to do this, you can make a lot of free plants. That's what I'm saying. But make sure wherever you're cutting from, wherever you're collecting seed from, you know the rules associated with that place. Every once in a while in the gardening groups online, I'll hear of somebody getting in trouble. Typically it's a small fine, but you want to make sure you play by the rules.
And remember your botany, because a lot of times you want to identify what you're collecting.
Yes, yeah, it's a good idea to know what you're going after in the first place.
Yeah, some things could be poisonous.
Some things can be poisonous if you touch or handle them, so it's always good to have at least some idea of what you're going for. In our home gardens, there's a lot of stuff, especially in the New Orleans area, a lot of our more common landscape plants are what we call pass-along plants, because it's very easy to just give your friend or your neighbor a piece of it and propagate it, right? We've all probably done this. That's really great. So that's a little added benefit of living here. And then in at least my own personal garden, I tend to let things stay in the garden a little longer than I normally would, like my vegetables and my herbs. I'll let them turn brown and crunchy and go to seed. Because then I end up with this kind of stuff, and this is next year's crop, but it's also enough to give away. And I've got 3 fridges in my house full of seed now. So it's really turned into a thing. This is the book that got me there. So if anyone's interested, it's called Seed to Seed. This is on your recommended reading list, which is on that page, the landing page of the online classroom. What's great is it breaks it down by crop and how to harvest that crop, dry it, and save the seed. But also, if you're trying to breed or propagate these things, remember we learned about this in the lectures, open pollinated, closed pollinated, hybrids. Without some protection, a lot of these things, or some thought, and keeping pollinators away from them, you can end up with unusable hybrids or crosses. It's kind of like the squash seed coming up in the compost pile, right? Every year we hear about somebody saying, oh, I've got a squash growing, but I cut it open and it looks like a watermelon on the inside. What gives? Well, watermelon probably cross-pollinated. Squash, you don't always know what you're going to get. You might end up with something really cool, but chances are you're going to get something that you don't really want to dedicate space in your garden to. So you want to make sure you're saving seed correctly, like peppers and eggplants, tomatoes, all your cucurbits. They're kind of promiscuous. So there's actual ways to keep them from cross-pollinating with other members of their tribe or their family, so that you can save that seed from year after year. That's heirloom seed saving, right? We talked a little bit about that in the video. So this is a really good place to start if you want to nerd out about seed saving. We talked a lot about native plants in this class because it's something the area is pretty into, right, with all our green infrastructure. A lot of our natives are grown best from seed or from division because they're perennial. You can grow an awful lot from seed though, and what's great about here is there's usually something to collect. So it might be a hibiscus or one of the more showy grasses or rudbeckia, coneflower, stuff like that. So you guys are lucky in that tonight we're going to walk around. I'm going to show you things that are in seed or in fruit. We're going to collect from the things that are ready, but then you're also going to be able to feel the things that aren't ready. And a lot of determining if these things are ready to clip off and if they're ready to harvest for seed is by feel and feeling the texture. Like you guys can hear that, right? Mm-hmm. This is ready. But I've got some on the plant at home that when I do this, it doesn't make a sound. It's not ready. There's too much moisture. The seed is not mature in there. You can even shake them in a lot of cases and you can hear the seed moving around. Those are all really good indicators that that seed is ripe and ready to clip. If you harvest things when they're still immature, you're not going to get a good germination rate if it germinates at all. Make sense? Okay. At my house, I'm collecting into these trays. These are just from the dollar store. But what I like about it is I can stack them so I get good airflow through the whole thing. That's really key. You don't want things to mold. That impacts your germination rate and the shelf life of the seed. I usually harvest right into the tray from the garden, and I'm putting the seed packet in there with the seed. So it's labeled with what it is. This is pine lance hibiscus and the year that it was collected. That gets really important as your seed collection grows. You want to use your old seed first. and try to use it up, and then you know when the seed is collected. These are #1 coin envelopes. You can get 500 for $14 at most of the office supply stores. This is the best thing I've found for storing the seeds. When I'm out in the forest or like a prairie situation, I'll use these. And you guys have these on your table too. Just some brown paper lunch sack, right? And the botanists I hang out have many jokes about brown paper sacks because we use so many of them. But you can actually harvest right into the bag. Always have a pencil with you. Label what it is, the date of collection, and where you collected it. That's usually very important. Things that I'm harvesting for my house, I usually don't say where I collected it, but if you're trying to keep track of a lot of different seeds or species that you're collecting, it's a good thing to put on there where it was collected and when.
You'll never at any time say, wow, I wrote too many labels.
No, and you will thank your past self, your future self will thank your past self for a thorough label. Trust me on that one. What's the better label tool?
Pencil.
Pencil, always, always. Why?
Water and cold.
Yes, and sun too.
And light.
Yep, so my partner actually made this mistake where he used a Sharpie on his plant labels. 6 weeks later, he couldn't read anything because it bleached out.
And the ones he had planted.
Yeah.
So he had all these little plants and
Didn't know what any of them were. So you want to make sure that you're using a pencil. #2 or softer pencil. I don't know what those tags went. Something like these. These are actually purchased vinyl plant tags, but if you're thrifty, people throw out vinyl window blinds constantly, and you can cut them up.
The old ones worked. The
old
new ones
work.
don't
Okay.
work.
You don't like the plasticky ones?
Well, we've
they're
tried.
so sleek you can't write them.
Yeah, we've tried them at the greenhouse and they just don't
That's a
work.
good tip. But the old school ones,
You could tape over.
you could tape over them too. I've seen popsicle sticks used with pencil too. It doesn't work quite as well because it gets wet and it does deteriorate over
And
time.
remember, composting, how fast it happens down here? Popsicle sticks are made out of wood.
Yep, yep. And some of our retail nursery growers use popsicle sticks, but if things sit for too long, they gotta relabel everything. So I like getting these bulk tags. You can get them from Greenhouse Mega Store, Amazon, lots of places online. #2 pencil, that's the way to go. Even when you're labeling these little seed packets, it's a good idea to use a pencil, and I learned this the hard way because if your freezer accidentally defrosts in one of your seed fridges and everything gets wet, while the seeds are still in their packet, I can kind of break them apart and re-dry them out, but I can't read if I wrote in pen what it was.
Water washes
The
it off.
water will bleed and wash it away, so if that were in pencil, wouldn't have that problem, so good idea to use your pencils. When we go out there though, everybody's got some paper sacks and some of these little collection envelopes. We want to make sure that we're taking that with us with the clippers. Joe is going to cover, first off, so seed saving, sexual or asexual production? Sexual reproduction, that's right, because there's 2 parent plants, right, resulting in offspring seeds. Joe's going to cover the asexual production that we're going to use. You want to talk about that before we turn them loose out there?
And really, when you're collecting, like Anna was talking about, know something about what you're collecting from and know what the mature fruit looks like and what it's supposed to be like. Anyone who's ever cut open something like a nice green pepper, like, you know, a cayenne pepper or something, or even bell peppers, you cut them open, they're full of these nice, large, nice looking seeds. Those seeds aren't mature. If you collect the seed from the green, immature fruit from your garden, if you say if you got, like Anna was talking about, you have the heirlooms and you're collecting them, and you collecting it from the immature fruit, the fruit that's not ripened, you got immature seeds. And if they germinate at all, it's going to be very, very low. You can have a bag full of seeds and plant them all and nothing comes up. And if you compare them to from the mature plant or the mature seed that you collected, the seed will look identical, but it didn't fully develop and get to maturity. And so it's not going to be viable. It can't survive the drying process and everything. And so know what the mature fruit looks like so that you're actually collecting mature seed.
My father-in-law used to grow peppers because my grandmother-in-law cooked, and she loved the bell peppers. but they were too bland for him. So he used to plant jalapeno peppers right next to the butter peppers, and it picked up the spice. It crossed.
Wow.
They threw the jalapenos away because they were too strong for them, but that butter picker, so be careful what you plant next to. What?
There's some myth to that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the more common myths that we get.
His worked, his did.
Okay.
Maybe it's just in peppers, who knows?
Yeah. Okay. You wanna-
And of course, asexual propagation, that's everything else. And there's one type of seed that's asexual propagation. You guys remember that from the botany lecture? I like to just throw this out. It's like, that's the kind of thing I might throw at you on a test. No, not really. Apomixis. And that's when, there are certain orange tree varieties, a lot of the rootstocks that they use for orange trees that they propagate or graft onto, the seeds are produced by apomixis. And that's the seed actually inside the fruit develops as a mature seed that will germinate and produce a plant, and it never was pollinated, never was fertilized. It actually happens within the ovule and the ovary itself. That happens, and there's only a few plants that happens to. So that's just like something you might win the trivia prize at the bar with. But it's not going to be very common. And everything else is asexual propagation. The most common method that people use and think of as asexual propagation is doing cuttings. And that's one of the things we're going to be doing tonight as a lab, is going out and taking cuttings. All the other asexual propagation methods a lot of people know about, and they don't really think of it as that, is anything that's not a true bulb, like corms, or rhizomes, things like that, that you can actually cut them up into pieces, and every piece will make a new plant. Like the white potato, it's an underground stem, it's a tuber. You cut it up into pieces, and everywhere, it's got little buds all over it, and every one of those will make a new plant. If you take something like a true bulb, like an onion bulb, and you cut it up into 5 or 6 pieces, none of them are going to make a plant. You kill it. And so that's another reason to know your botany, because you can then identify different things like that, and you'll be able to know what you can do to them and not. And these are on the list, right? These are on your list. Something like this, if you're going to do asexual propagation, or even any type of propagation actually, this is really, 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 really useful. The biggest reason it's useful is this tells you what people have done that worked. So if you see a plant and you use your botany to identify it, and you know what it is, you can go into a manual like this and look it up, and they will tell you whether it's easy to propagate from seed, or cuttings, or you're better off doing, say, something like air layering or ground layering. You saw those different methods were mentioned in the propagation videos. So there's all different methods of asexual propagation. But what you don't want to do is to go see a plant that your neighbor has that you think is really neat, and you want to get one for yourself, and so you're out there constantly at midnight pruning your neighbor's plant, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you're not getting any plants because you didn't look it up, and it says, if you want to propagate this one, don't do cuttings, but do maybe ground layering. And so you could have just gone out there and buried the limb, and 3 weeks later had your plant, instead of chopping it down to nothing. So, silly points, but I make that to say, take advantage of what other people have done. Yes, sir.
So, some of these are read, they're written for the entire nation, but obviously we talk about how things are different, and they say like, take winter cuttings when things are dormant or something like that. Well, I got tomato plants that overwinter.
Oh, yeah.
Just never get dormant. So like, what do we do? Wait until it freezes, or can we kind of cheat? Or do we have to do like 3 times as much?
It's still good to do, I've come up with this problem too, where it says, hey, dormant wood cuttings.
Yeah.
Never goes dormant here.
Sure.
So the winter season is still a good time to take it, the cool season. So for us, typically that's like December through February. And that's when my base.
When it's as close to dormant as it's gonna get.
Yeah, it's not actively growing as fast, so that's a good time to make your cuttings. And yeah, you're not the only one that's noticed that, because what do you do?
Yeah, and there's little silly, little points in here, like if you take making cuttings from a fig bush or something like that. What you'll find is if you take your cuttings, and they usually are leafless cuttings, they take them during the dormancy of a fig. That's the best time when they have no leaves. You take your cutting and you actually store it in the refrigerator for a day or two before you put it in the rooting media. What you're letting it do is actually callus over where all that, anyone's ever picked a fig or cut a fig, there's a lot of latex in there. And that kind of stuff is not really good for rooting. So you let it callus over. Same thing with plumeria. If you don't let those callus, most of the time if you just cut it fresh and stick it in the ground, it'll rot before it'll root. If you let it callus first, then it will root. And so those types of points are in this type of manual. So that's why, go ahead and look it up before you start doing all the work and putting all that effort into it. And that will help you a lot. So this is real important. And using rooting hormone, that's what's in the little tiny white container in the middle of your table. That's rooting hormone. There's some things that they will root. There's some stuff like anyone who's ever gotten basil at the grocery stores. You take it home, you stick it in a glass of water to keep it fresh until you use it, and 3 days later it's got roots. If you hang it in the shower, a basil plant hanging in the shower where it's always moisture in the air, it'll probably root just like they're hanging in the air. Some things, they're just looking for a reason to grow roots. And then there's other things that are very more difficult to root as cuttings. And so using the rooting hormone is real important in those cases. If you don't use the rooting hormone, you might get 1% rooting. If you use the rooting hormone, you might get 75 to 80% rooting. That's how much difference it can make. And this kind of thing will tell you which it is. Saw a question back there.
What exactly is rooting hormone and how is it made?
What exactly is rooting hormone? It is, usually it's chemically analogous to plant hormones, the hormones that are involved in root initiation. IAA, indole acetic acid, is one of them. That's one that's always in there, and I forgot the other one too.
So they're just synthetically created hormones?
Yes.
If you wanted to DIY it, you can find willow branches and soak it in water, and a lot of those same hormones are in the willow.
How long do you have to soak it?
I've just done it overnight, and then you dip your cuttings in branches. The branches, cut it all out.
The branch is brown.
The brown. Yep. And you cut it up real small, steep it overnight, you use that as your rooting hormone. And if you Google willow rooting hormone, it'll come up how to do it.
And with the rooting hormones, they're even, because propagation is a science. That's people's business. They sell plants. Like rooting hormone number 1, rooting hormone number 2, rooting hormone number 3. And the only difference between 1, 2, and 3 is the percentages of the 2 different hormones that they put in there. And they found that having a certain percentage may improve the rooting of some plants as opposed to others. So it really does become a science. And sometimes, as in all, seems to be all horticultural pursuits or anything to do with living things, is it can also be an art. As an example, there's a group of people over at Pelican Greenhouse that produce roses from cuttings for Pelican to sell, and they're really good at it. They've been doing it for years. And they take cuttings, they root the cuttings, and there's usually several hundred roses that are sold every year that they take and make cuttings from. One year, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, they called me in because every cutting they were sticking, they weren't getting any rooting. They would stay in the ground and eventually rot, in the boxes and eventually rot. They couldn't get anything to root. And that year, they were trying different rooting hormones, they started trying different rooting media, started treating the cuttings different as they collected them. Nothing was really working and changing. The next year, everything was back to normal. and there was no really good explanation as to what was going on. It could have been the previous season that had changed somehow the physiology of the rose bushes that year, and they just weren't as prone to root. And we didn't investigate it intensively to try to figure it out, but so that's some art involved and some chance, as well as science. And if anyone's ever done grafting, then you'll know that there is an art in plant production and horticulture. There's some people that, I mean, they can graft 20 citrus trees a minute and get 95% take, and then there's other people that can do 2 or 3 a minute and get 0%.
Do y'all know any grafting experts in New Zealand?
They exist, but they're not gonna teach you how, because that's how they get their roots.
The really good ones. And there are some hobbyists that do it, but we really don't have
Yeah, I
know
haven't
which ones
found
are really
anyone
good.
who's good at it locally. We've taught some vegetable grafting courses here that we should probably do again, because
Yeah.
that's really fun, and it's a little quicker than doing woody material. You can kind of see results faster, like within a week or 2. But most of the guys locally who are doing it, they're doing it to produce thousands of trees per year, and they're using migrant labor to do it. So they're not gonna teach anyone, this is their business. Yeah, I've asked. Yeah.
You graft a lot in bonsai. You could look at a bonsai book and it'll give you some basics of how to start. What works and what doesn't.
There's a guy who lives in West Metairie that crafts avocado trees.
Yeah, the
And he
citrus tree
goes to the garden shows every year.
Yep.
And he
will-
swears they'll produce avocados. I
Do
don't know.
I
never bought
provide
one.
avocados.
And that noise.
Oh, they will produce avocados, yeah.
Will it be edible?
Yeah.
Huh. Why are you being so skeptical over there?
Because they freeze.
But there are varieties that don't freeze and will produce very nice avocados.
A lot of them
A lot of them.
come back from the
They
roots.
do, so now the game is it gonna get big enough to fruit and produce in that year before it freezes down again? And this last, February was rough on.
Anyone who started an avocado tree from an avocado they bought in the grocery store, they're gonna be very disappointed because it will take minimum of 15 years before it starts to flower and produce fruit. And if it gets below freezing, at any time during that 15 years, it's gonna freeze it down to the ground.
I have one, but I don't think it's from a grocery store.
Yeah.
And it's very big, and it's made maybe 3 or 4 avocados in the past 4 years. It hasn't made any this year yet.
And there are varieties of avocado that are viable in this area.
I've been doing cuttings on the lines, I don't know if it's true, but instead of just cutting it, you're also supposed to take a razor blade or the sharp end of your shears and take the outside, like bottom ½ inch off before putting rooting hormone on. Does that help?
What you shouldn't be doing is, you shouldn't like cut it and then strip if you're just stripping just the bark and just leaving the cambial layer, that would probably help because you got a whole lot of living tissue that is going to want to regenerate roots. But the best thing I've seen, and you'll actually see it in this describing doing cutting sometimes, cut it at an angle almost always. You want to cut it at an angle. That gives you more surface area of the cambial layer, and it's easier to then stick it into the rooting media as well. And then make slices just down the edge like that. Make 3 or 4 on it. Because what you do when you slice it, you're cutting through that epidermal layer and opening it up to where you're reaching the cambial layer. And then you use your horting maul and it gets on all that living tissue area. And you'll get more roots a lot of times by doing that. But by actually peeling away the lower area is not the best, because usually you don't leave just the cambium. You peel everything away.
Okay, you're saying so perpendicular as opposed to parallel slicing it down.
It would still be parallel slicing, so like.
You're cutting like this. Yeah, just scoring it is what you're doing. scoring.
Yeah, vertical.
Yeah, vertical slicing, it
And
scores
when we
it.
go out, we're gonna make our cuttings and bring them back in here, and then kind of go through the process of stripping the lower leaves, reducing the leaf surface, and cutting them correctly, so. Yeah, that's one of the things.
Yes, sir.
Sanitation, how, is that one of the things where people go, yes, you really need to sanitize, and no one does it, or do you really, really need to do it?
Joe, did you sanitize your box? I'm pretty sure you did.
Yeah, I mean, it starts out clean, sanitize it, and the material I go in. The putting, I mean, the rooting mix I use, you know, you can use different things, you'll find different recipes, different places. I usually use 1/3 perlite, 1/3 peat, and 1/3 composting material, properly composted, because that means, you know, it doesn't have the bad organisms in it. Peat naturally holds moisture and has some antifungal, antibacterial properties to it. And perlite, I use the coarse perlite, and it creates a nice airy environment that it'll hold the moisture, plus it creates air pockets so that you don't suffocate the roots as they develop. And that's what I put in our boxes.
Okay, what about like instruments and stuff like that?
It's a good idea, 10% leaf water, in my house, I just dip my tools, like, my clippers, I dip it in a coffee mug full of.
And
And-
that's just
and
so
when
you're
you
not
take-
spreading a disease from that plant you got it from.
Yeah, and when you take a cutting, obviously you wouldn't want to take it from a diseased plant.
Yeah, actually this morning, somebody had made some cuttings and it was, once they picked it up, they found out it was infested with mealybugs. So you wouldn't want to put that in here, because guess what, it's gonna infest everything else. So make sure when you're taking your cuttings, you're looking for diseases and insects, you want to leave that stuff out.
Do you have an opinion versus, for coconut coir versus peat? As
I'm a
far as-
fan of the coconut core,
I'm
because
sorry, say again?
I like the coconut core better because it's sustainably harvested. The peat is unsustainably harvested, it's not a renewable resource, so most of the industry is switching to the coconut core. Actually, we talked about it, it's hard to find,
It's
yeah.
hard to find this year. Walmart and Chalmette had it last year for like nothing.
There's a shortage because the industry has started making strides away
Can we
from.
go to West Louisiana?
No, we get 10 more years of climate change.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll be there. So then we should use more peat, because they'll get there quicker.
Right. You forgot? Yeah.
So, a long time ago, when I was like in elementary school, I'd seen this advertisement for a tree that had, it was a fruit tree with a bunch of different, is that real?
That's real.
Does
They're
it
called
work?
fruit cocktail trees, and what they did was they took one rootstock and they grafted multiple things to it.
But you can't put an apple on an orange tree.
Why not?
It won't take.
Really?
There
Apples and oranges.
are things that, they have to be closely related in almost all cases before the graft to take.
Okay, so you can't just like graft an olive tree onto an oak tree?
No, but you could take an olive tree and graft 4 varieties of olive to it.
Ooh, yeah,
And
yeah.
like you can take a citrus tree, if you only have room for one citrus tree in your yard, and you can have it producing oranges and satsumas and kumquats and grapefruits.
Also, if anyone wants to start that business, nobody's doing it.
Oh.
It's a hot tip.
Gotta find somebody that'll teach you how to grow.
Other questions? before
She
we-
remembers it.
Yeah, no, great.
Can you try sanitizing your tools with white vinegar?
You could do that. It would
Not
probably
as
be more
good.
of a 50-50 mix to compost it right now.
And have you tried it with like chlorine-free bleach?
It would work the same, I think.
No.
The ones, the chlorine-free
It's
ones?
the chlorine.
Okay.
And you're talking about doing it with vinegar? Well, it's only, most vinegar is only 5% acetic acid. And if you get natural vinegar, which has 5% acetic acid, and then take the little stuff out of the bottom and look at it in a microscope, you'll see the vinegar eelworms that are under there. So it's not killing stuff.
Worms in vinegar?
Yes,
Oh.
vinegar worms.
Thanks a lot.
Little tiny guys.
Not white vinegar that you
Yeah,
buy.
what's our question?
Oh, good. Sometimes it's best not to know.
Guys,
Yeah, we have
stop. We got one more question.
I wanted to give a tip about coconut coir. So Gardener's Supply is like a very reliable source online. They're up in Vermont, and they have different coarseness levels of coconut coir. And there is also, I don't remember the name, but there is a hydroponic shop in town that has coarse coconut coir.
They're on Decatur, right?
Yeah.
Grow Wiser.
Yeah, Grow Wiser.
Frank, he's got 2 storefronts now.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah.
What
Coir, C-O-I-R. What are the two biggest advantages to asexual propagation?
You clone the plant.
You're cloning the plant, so that means you're gonna get the same thing you start with, unless something funky happens, which does happen in nature. But you're cloning. What's the other one?
They start a little bigger.
You what?
They start a little bigger.
Mature versus juvenile. Start a little bigger. That's why I always go back to the avocado. If you buy a grafted avocado tree, you plant it, it's usually a year old at most. A second year, you're gonna have it flowering and producing fruit, almost all the varieties now. If you start from an avocado pit, 15 years. And it's because grafting, doing rooted cuttings, things like that, you're starting with a mature plant. And when it puts on roots, it still thinks it's that old because genetically, physiologically, in almost all cases, it's still that same age. I love gardenias. I have about 50 varieties. I make cuttings from gardenias. I have gardenias growing this tall with a big flower on them. Because they are old gardenias as far as that little plant knows. They'll put on a bud and they'll flower. If I started it from seed, it would probably be a minimum of 5 years before it even started to think about putting on buds and flowering. And so those are the two big advantages. You get what you think you're going to get, and you start with an already mature plant.
Okay. Heidi, one more.
My uncle loved camellias, and he had a little backyard. He only had room for 5 bushes, but he grafted on it. He had 42 different flowers he could get.
Wow.
And they were gorgeous.
All the different sizes, shapes, and colors. Yeah, camellias are very easy to graft, actually. I heard that. I've never tried it.
So you can do it with flowers, not just stuff you eat. You make a funky looking plant.
Alright, well, we've got 1 hour to turn you loose in this place. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the materials on our table. Yes.
Don't they need to know that you need 4 leaf buds to grow something? I mean, to grow.
No, it depends on the plant. That's why going in here, it should just say you need 4 nodes on a cutting to get it to root. That's not true. And sometimes you don't even need a node.
Yeah, and we're gonna walk as a group, and I'm gonna point out things that are ready to take cuttings from, and we tell you what they are. And each person, we can fit about 200 cuttings in this box. We got about
2 or
50.
3 cuttings per,
Yeah.
at least 2 cuttings per person.
2 to 3 cuttings per person. They don't all have to be the same thing. We've only got 9 pairs of hand pruners, so make sure you're sharing and handing them off to people. I'm also going to be pointing out seed that is ready and seed heads that are not ready. So you can touch and feel and try to get a feel for it. Yes, one question.
When we're collecting, is it okay to put multiple different things in one bag?
Yes, if you can remember that, you're a better person than me.
Yeah.
But the
Or you can
bags,
separate the seeds once they come.
yeah, the bags are for seeds. The cuttings you hold on to, we'll come back in here and we'll stick seeds.
One point, when you're taking cuttings,
You can bring them with
be kind to the mother plant.
Say, listen up, this is important.
This is it's a pruning tip because that's what you're doing. If you prune a plant, and here's the bud, and you prune it up here, you are doing that plant a disservice. Because here's the bud, and this stem that you leave sticking out is going to die. It becomes a place for disease to come in. It can attract insects. And so you would never leave a stub when you're pruning. So don't leave a stub when you're taking cuttings. Cut it back to a bud. If you need to trim it, take it back to wherever you're sticking them and trim it. But don't leave the stub sticking out on the plant. You're not doing it a favor at all.
So everybody's going to choose 3 cuttings, take the cuttings. We're going to come back in here and show you how to clean them up, how to stick them in the rooting hormone, and we'll put them in your box. This is your evening class box. We'll be able to pot them up, and you'll take those plants home in a few weeks.
Can we leave our stuff in
You
there?
can leave your
Yeah,
stuff.
I'm going to lock it once everybody's out.
So we're going to gather kind of right here outside the classroom. I think this one is called San Carlos Festival. We're going to see a lot of salvias on our little plant walk. These all root very easily from cuttings. They're great pass-along plants. They really do great in our climate. So if if anyone wants this San Carlos Festival, go ahead and make the cutting of it.
Can you tell us how much sun or shade each thing needs?
These prefer sun. Yep. And if you look at kind of where we are in the garden, it gives you some clues, but I'll try to remember to answer that. The thing is, we're not going to label whose plants are what, so we're just going to throw a lot of stuff in the box and we're going to divvy them up in a few weeks. So if anyone wants this salvia, it's a nice one. Oh, we're just walking around.
There's another one, salvia.
Anyone need this? Yeah, here's mint. If anyone wants some mint, this is a nice one. Make sure you pass your clippers around if you're a keeper of the clippers. Hey, what kind of clippers, anyone?
It's really hard.
Garden. It's got a ton of stuff we can make cuttings from. We've got rosemary up top. We've got oregano. We've got different basils. Remember Joe was saying the basil roots very easily. Here's some more of that salvia. There's another one here. This is Mexican tarragon. That's another one that it's kind of an anise flavored or licorice flavored herb. It's great for cooking. If anyone wants cuttings of that, there's also many different varieties of mint along that back wall. So feel free to make cuttings out of here as well.
Did she say basil? Oh, I'm sorry.
Cut up, there's a lot of little seed in there. It's a really great plant. Nicotiana. So you want to look for the brown seed pods. And one seed pod's going to have a few hundred seeds in it, so you only need one.
Oh my gosh.
This is a worm bin? Nope, this is a cutting box. We're going to put all our cuttings in.
No.
They're all clothing flavors in my driveway. And one of them is Gladys. One of the flavors is Gladys. In the store, I built a I moved everything by myself while I was killing good physical characters in my back. It was really stupid. And I said, I'm never moving another single one in my life. I'll go out there. I found it at
I couldn't believe that. So I went out to
and they're always
yeah, it's always things.
like $84 a piece. That's too much. Okay, so if I have no idea.
Before COVID though, I traveled a lot, but I worked from home when I was all over the country. I went to Maine.
Once they mature, right, you harvest the seed and then let the seed completely dry. I put mine in the dehydrator for one day and
How long is it gonna stay in the
yeah, the viability of seeds is very variety and species dependent. Like there have been seeds found in the pyramids of grain and stuff that they planted and it was fine. It was kept in a dry environment, it never got really hot in there, they stayed viable. And if you buy a packet of them, lettuce seed, and you keep them in perfect condition, the next year you probably might not have the germination rate as the year before.
I spent a lot of money last year on organic seed, and I got television, like maybe 10%. I was not happy with that at all.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get you guys ready so you can put your stuff in the rooting box. And you guys saw how we made this on one of the videos. I just have to share a quick sidelight. It's kind of like another one of my trivia stories. But this one, because you see it, you can find YouTubes about how to do it. You can find it online, and it's how to make a rooted rubber plant leaf. You can make a root, you can root a rubber plant leaf. And they'll go through the whole video, and yes, it makes roots and everything, but it's what's termed a blind rooted cutting, because rubber plant, the ficus, they have to have a living bud to make a new plant. But you can take a leaf from a rubber tree plant and stick the petiole in the ground. I don't even know if you need to use rooting hormone, and the roots will come out from that petiole, so you'll have roots down here, the long petiole, the big dark green leaf, and it will sit there until the leaf dies and dries up, and you will never, ever, ever, ever get a plant from that. Because it doesn't have a bud on what you rooted. So that's another good reason to check out what you're doing, because just because you can get roots to grow on something doesn't mean you're going to get a plant from it. And then there's the opposite side of that, like begonias. You guys saw a lot of begonias. And begonias is just want to use an example. There are other plants that you can do this with. If you take a begonia leaf, you can take a leaf the size of my hand and cut it this way and 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 make 15 little pieces, and then stick each one of those little pieces in a rooting compound, or sometimes just lay it on top of it. And each one of those little pieces will make roots in a new plant. And so knowing how to do it goes a long way. And now, knowing how to do it, we're going to do rooting cuttings. So, so something like this, Anna's taking a cutting, and I would always check them out, but what you want to do is cut at an angle across there. And the reason I cut it at an angle is because by doing that, I'm creating more surface area, exposing more of that living cambial layer so that it will have more of a chance to come up to the rooting hormone and get rooted. Now, when you got a plant like this, you know it because I was just talking to some people about cacti. What is one of the things that goes on in plant leaves concerning related to water? Transpiration. So, transpiration means the plant is giving off water, and if it gives off water, it's going to try to take up water. And the main way it takes up water is through its roots. So if you take a cutting like this and you leave all these leaves on there, the plant is transpiring, it's trying to take up water, it doesn't have any roots, and a lot of times the leaves will just die, and they'll also become a point where fungi and stuff will have something to grow on. So when you do your cuttings, you want to trim away most of the excess leaf foliage. And see, that's about the right amount for something like this. If you have something with larger leaves, huge leaves, then you've got 2 leaves left. You go through and cut those in half to reduce the leaf. So leaving a little bit of leaf foliage is not bad, but leaving a lot is bad. And like we talked about earlier with fig plants, those, most of the time they recommend taking the cuttings during the dormant period, and so they're not going to have any leaves. So with figs and some other plants, you really don't need the leaves. And a lot of plants you can root without having leaves on there. It's just when you do have some leaf, as soon as those little roots start to form, the leaves have the water and everything they need to do the photosynthesis and start feeding the plant, even if it's just a little amount of leaf, so that the plant will actually mature faster if you leave a little bit of leaf. What about flowers? Cut the flowers and get rid of them. You don't want the flowers in there. You want to leave just the vegetative tissue in there. And then you would dip it in the rooting hormone that you have on your table, and you don't want excess. You want, because the rooting hormone, so it's just barely on there. And then, and stick them, everyone's going to stick these, and you just find a blank spot. And this stem, I can tell, it's pretty tough, so it'll go in. I can easily push that into the rooting media. If you have something that's very brittle or very soft, you go ahead and make a hole first, put it in there, and then fill the soil back around it. And so everyone's going to go ahead and prepare your cuttings to go into the rooting hormone, the rooting box, and then go ahead and bring them up, and we're going to stick it full.
I have a question. When it comes to taking the leaves off and making cuttings, if you do it with like more of a snap versus a tip, is there a better, like you mentioned you have a little area.
With the leaf, if you have some stems and they have, I always cut my leaves off because this one probably won't do it, but if you got a big leaf like this and it's got a pretty big petiole and you break it off, it can actually strip the bark, the candle layer all the way down. And you don't want to peel off any more than you have to. Now another thing, and a lot of times it's in the books, with some of the woodier stems, I do it with the gardenias. I don't really have to, but it helps get more roots. You actually score the stem. So if it's one like this, I would cut it at an angle, usually with bigger stems. Then I just make little score marks running up and down the stem like this. And what I'm doing when I do that is I'm cutting through the epidermis, cutting through the bark, and making another area of living tissue that's going to get contacted by the rooting hormone, and so there's more chance for roots to develop all along the stem then.
So would you say you do that for any woodier plant, like like on rosemary? So like would you do that for rosemary too?
Yeah, but as a general rule, you get more woodier ones.
So I got this bin and say, can I cut this in half and plant?
Yeah.
I gotta take these little bitty things too and just plant
the lower leaves off. Yeah.
Can I plant the lower leaves as well?
Okay. Yeah, the leaves won't make a plant.
He was saying how to do it.
Yes, and now some people collected, like a lot of the succulents, they really root easily from from leaf cuttings, or not. Actually, they are stem cuttings. Some of them are leaves, but most succulents, like the prickly pear cactus that we have here, that's actually a stem. And so you start doing stem cutting, and something like this one, if you just lay it on the surface of your media, and these don't need as much high humidity, so they might even root better than in a rooting box, just to put them on a pot full of soil and lay it on top of there. And what I like to do if I want to make multiple ones, because it'll make roots naturally, but it's usually because it has a little bit of wound here and there. But with one like this, I would probably go through and cut here, just make cuts. Like this, through it.
And that'll produce separate plants.
And then where I made each of those cuts, it'll probably make roots, and a new little plant will come up. And so you can make 20, 25 plants out of that.
So this doesn't need a box?
No, and actually, like I said, these, in the box, they are xerophytes. They like drier environments, so they will actually root better in something other than this. They'll tend to rot.
So like if I have a cactus mix and
Yep. Lay on top.
You know what you can use? You know,
It does make her hair.
you know,
It's the Burbank Spine Scrub.
you know,
That's the stem base fruit.
you know, with soil, it's like the seed, you know, if you put the top on it, it's like green.
Probably spend a couple of hundred years. That's probably 2 or 3 per person.
Absolutely gonna get this.
It's rolled up. It's a pain in the ass, but I've done it
this will start to block form roots. So that means take it home and cut it into pieces and stick it in a pot and just keep it moist. And you put a plastic bag and loosely go through it. Yes.
Those are great things.
That marinated leaf, I love it.
I'll put the top on and stick it somewhere where it doesn't get much over 80 degrees or so and not wet summer. Yeah. Yeah, that's standard. Okay, we're mostly finished with the lab. I want to, can everybody hear me real well? I want to make a couple of points on the seed, because a lot of you planted seed, and you're going to take the seed home because you want to plant it and make new plants. Make sure you check what the germination requirements are for your seed, because that's another thing that you'll find in the books, and it's real important because some seed from some plants require cold treatment before they'll germinate. And if you collected seed from something like that, a lot of times milkweed is like that. If it doesn't get the cold treatment, germination is very, very poor. Other plants require sunlight. So if you bury them the way most people, myself included, you think you're going to plant a seed, you make a little hole, put it in there and cover it up. There's some plants that their seeds without light, they will not germinate. So make sure you know whether you need light or not, and how deep that you're going to bury it. And I don't think we collected anything out here like that. It's usually larger, harder, woodier seeds, but some of them have to be scarified. So they need to be, you need to take a file and cut them or something like that to open up the seed coat and make a bridge, a break in the seed coat so the moisture can move in to where the embryo is. And there are seeds that, especially a lot of tree seeds, that when the tree drops them, that seed coat is so hard, and the reason it is because it drops the seed, and the seed doesn't want to germinate until the environment's right. It doesn't want to grow up underneath mama. And some of them, and some of the Midwestern states, especially a lot of the pine seeds, they have to go through fire before they'll germinate. And the whole reason, the plants are doing great there is because the plant makes seeds every year, they drop on the ground and they just stay there. And when the fire comes through and kills all the trees around, now there's nothing there to compete with them, and they reforest by germinating. So just some tidbits to check your seeds and see what they need before you just go bury them and then are disappointed if nothing comes up.
Next week, we're back across the street at Delgado. Remember? It's about habitat, so be sure you check your schedule. But next week, we're across the street. Be sure to bring your compostables. Remember, it's competitive.
Pizza party!
My pizza party!
like when, because I'll miss next.
As soon as we can.
As soon as you can.
It's like this one will probably go up tomorrow, but like I said, you're getting the bloopers
I'll
and
look for it.
everything.
Yeah, it's kind of dependent on our schedules and the technology, and the Wi-Fi connection, which is better sometimes.
Uh-huh.
Like, cut all the leaves off, like you would for the other side?
Okay, you guys remember,
There's different requirements for each lab, so it makes sense to be here for some of them. Ferns.
Yeah.
that's right, is this, which part of the life cycle of the plant is this? It's the frond, but it's a stage in the life of the plant. All angiosperms start flourishing. This is the sporophyte. It's going to make spores. That's its way of reproduction. And then remember, the spores germinate, and then there's the male part and the female part come together and make a gametophyte. This will never make a rooty cutting. It'll make spores, and you can collect the spores.
Part of the rhizome.
Yeah, you can collect the rhizome. And so that's one thing that, you would get from this. If you look up getting ferns, they'll say, go underground and cut those pieces that are underground, the rhizomes, and that's how you reproduce it asexual. You can't do it from cuttings like that.
So if I dry it out, you plant these little spores?
I don't know if it has mature spores on the back or not. Pull out your hand lens and see.
I don't know what a mature spore looks like.
Could you just rub it on the ground?
Rub it over a piece of wet paper.
Yeah, and actually, you can actually do those
Put it over.
if you're really interested, you can collect fern spores, spread them around on some growing media, and you can take your lens and find the little heart-shaped gametophytes under there. Most people don't go to that trouble because it's like, okay, I'll believe the picture.
The reading material went through this big long explanation about putting the mature spores in soapy dishwashing liquid water, or water with little few drops of dishwashing liquid, and taking Jiffy pods, expanding them, pulling the netting off the top, using a syringe and putting it, and nobody else read this. It sounds totally insane. Get the rhizome, take it up and get the rhizome.
Yeah, get the rhizome.
If we heard that kind of like the leaves are half dead, do you think you could still get the rhizome and resurrect it, or is it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, how dead is?
Because fronds will die back, and the rhizome will perfectly fine. You might just need to be divided or repotted.
You've seen the resurrection fern, right? It gets completely dry, crunchy dry, and then it rains and you go out and you think, what happened? Now all the limbs are green. But with most rhizomes like that are from ferns or from gingers or things like that. If you take one and you cut it and it's light green or white on the inside, it's still alive and it'll make a plant. If you cut it and it's brown on the inside, don't add it.
It's like ours.
Alright, we're gonna cut you guys loose. If you have more questions, let me know.
Anybody want to be?